Welcome to Module 3, Anticipatory Actions for Drought, part of the course Getting Ahead of Drought, Innovative Risk Monitoring and Financing Options. Having covered drought fundamentals in Module 1 and monitoring and early warning in Module 2, this module turns to how early warning signals are converted into coordinated, pre-financed action on the ground. This module, Anticipatory Actions for Drought, focuses on turning early warnings into timely, coordinated actions and financing triggers to reduce impacts and protect vulnerable communities. By the end of this module, you should be able to achieve the following objectives. First, understand the concept and principles of anticipatory action and forecast-based approaches. Second, identify sector-specific anticipatory measures in agriculture and water. Third, translate triggers into standard operating procedures with clear roles and coordination mechanisms. And fourth, link early warning triggers with financing tools for timely action. We begin with Section 3.1, Understanding Anticipatory Action. Anticipatory action, or AA, refers to pre-agreed actions taken ahead of a predicted hazardous event, based on forecasts and risk analysis, to prevent or reduce impacts on lives, livelihoods, and humanitarian needs before they fully unfold, according to the Anticipation Hub. Anticipatory action links early warning information with flexible funds to trigger actions that reduce the impact of predictable shocks and stresses on the most vulnerable people, according to FAO 2024. Anticipatory action rests on three core characteristics: it occurs before a shock, it has protective intent, and it relies on pre-agreed, risk-informed triggers. Anticipatory action is a crucial component in addressing the ongoing cycle where rising disaster risks and impacts lead to greater humanitarian needs and increased aid and costs. Climate change worsens this cycle by increasing the frequency and severity of climate-related hazards. Anticipatory action is most effective when response activities, triggers, and decision-making protocols are agreed upon in advance, enabling the rapid release of prearranged financing as soon as predefined conditions are met. The core idea behind anticipatory action is to act early to prevent or reduce impacts before a crisis hits. This rests on 7 principles. People-centered, aim to protect the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of people at risk, including the most vulnerable. Risk-informed, use credible data, forecasts, and risk analysis to identify threats and inform early action. Action-based, define in advance what actions to take, when, where, and how, based on predetermined triggers. Timely, act early enough, before impacts occur, to be most effective. Collaborative, strengthen coordination and partnerships among local, national, and international actors. Funded, ensure timely and predictable financing is available in advance to enable rapid implementation. And accountable, be transparent and accountable to affected people and communities about decisions and actions. Taken together, anticipatory action strengthens preparedness, reduces humanitarian needs, and supports communities to withstand and recover from crises. A forecast-based approach is a proactive framework that automatically triggers pre-planned relief operations and funding based on specific weather or climate forecast thresholds, according to Underhill, WHH. This works through 6 connected building blocks. First, risk knowledge, understanding hazards, exposure, and vulnerability of communities to identify who and what is at risk, and where. Second, forecasts and early warnings, using credible, reliable forecasts and early warnings to predict hazard events and their potential impacts. Third, triggers, defining and agreeing on clear trigger thresholds, based on forecast information, that will activate early action. Fourth, pre-agreed early actions, identifying, designing, and agreeing on context-specific early actions to reduce impacts and protect lives and livelihoods. Fifth, prearranged financing, ensuring funds are arranged in advance so that resources are available immediately when triggers are met. And sixth, early action implementation, implementing actions quickly and effectively once the trigger is reached, before the hazard fully impacts. These building blocks work together in a coordinated system to ensure the right action reaches the right people at the right time, underpinned by cross-cutting principles, people-centered and locally led, inclusive and equitable, accountable and transparent, collaborative and coordinated, and continuously learning and adapting. It's worth contrasting anticipatory action directly against traditional response. Anticipatory action acts early, based on forecasts, to prevent or reduce impacts. It follows 3 steps: forecasting and early warning, which monitors hazards and issues early warnings, a pre-agreed action plan, with agreed triggers and early actions already in place, and pre-arranged financing, with funding ready for rapid activation. When the hazard threatens, a cyclone, flood, or heat wave, for example, anticipatory action is implemented before the hazard strikes, leading to reduced impacts, fewer losses, protected lives and livelihoods, and lower humanitarian needs. Traditional response, by contrast, reacts after impacts occur, leading to greater losses and higher needs. It follows 3 steps: assessing needs, evaluating the situation and needs on the ground, planning and prioritizing, planning response activities, and mobilizing and allocating funding, often with delays. When the hazard strikes and impacts occur on lives, livelihoods, and systems, aid delivery in response follows, with resources mobilized and delivered after the crisis, leading to greater impacts, more losses, higher needs, disrupted livelihoods, and recovery costs. In short, anticipatory action means acting early, reducing impacts, saving lives, and protecting livelihoods, while traditional response means reacting late, at higher cost, with more suffering and longer recovery. Source: adapted from OCHA Anticipatory Action Toolkit. Let's look at how this plays out across an actual seasonal timeline, from 2023 to 2024. The season runs through dry season, planting, growing, a reduced harvest, and back into dry season. Overlaid on this are 4 phases. AA System Development. The Anticipatory Action Plan is prepared and funds pre-allocated in 2022 and 2023. The updated plan is approved in July 2023 and presented to local communities. A sector working group is established, and trainings and awareness-raising workshops on anticipatory action are held. The Readiness Phase, running through the dry season, trigger monitoring and meetings with the National Anticipatory Action Technical Working Group, Anticipatory Action Plan activation, and internal resource mobilization. The Activation Phase, around the planting window, household targeting and contracting a cooperating partner, followed by project launch, a meeting with local authorities to launch activities, dissemination of early warning messages, and a baseline survey. Implementation of anticipatory actions then runs through the growing and reduced harvest period, early warning message dissemination, conditional cash transfers and agricultural input distribution, water points rehabilitation, and small ruminant distribution. And finally, as the dry season returns, an endline survey and an after-action review with key national stakeholders. Source: WFP, 2025. This brings us to Section 3.2, Designing Triggers and Learning from Activation. Let's look at a real activation, Madagascar's Grand Sud. The 2023-24 drought forecast triggered a pre-planned anticipatory action activation in 3 districts. Trigger and risk. In July 2023, a moderate drought was forecast for October to December. This forecasted drought would overlap the October to March lean season. In August 2023, the Technical Working Group confirmed activation of the Anticipatory Action Plan. Grand Sud communities rely heavily on agriculture. Key figures: 75% of the population is categorized as poor. 80% of the population relies on agriculture as their main activity. The activation covered 3 districts, Sihome, Betroka, and Batayaki-Atsimo. And $4.26 million in funds were disbursed for anticipatory action. People reached. 151,000 people received anticipatory transfers, in the form of cash and drought-tolerant inputs. And 157,000 people were reached with early warning information. Source: WFP, 2025. Forecast-based action was converted into concrete household and community support, across 4 areas. Early warning. Messages explain the drought forecast and practical household actions, including prioritizing resistant crops such as millet and sorghum. Cash plus inputs. Anticipatory cash transfers in drought-tolerant agricultural inputs were distributed before and during the drought stress period. Water access. 11 boreholes and 21 community assets supported safer water access for households and agriculture. Livelihood protection. Cash distributions were linked to activities such as land preparation and reforestation to protect productive assets. Source: WFP, 2025. Creating a trigger mechanism means turning a mix of indicators and thresholds into one meaningful composite index, reliable enough to warn early, and clear enough to act on. This happens in 5 steps. Step 1. Define the conceptual framework, analyze drought risk and its impact on agriculture and food security, and identify the capacities needed to build a mechanism suited to the context. Step 2. Build a crisis timeline, overlay drought information on the agricultural calendar to find windows of opportunity for action, and identify which indicators are needed at each stage. Step 3. Select and normalize indicators, choose a mix of forecast, seasonal observation, vulnerability, and impact indicators using SMART criteria, then rescale them so they become comparable. Step 4. Weight and aggregate indicators. Weight each indicator and group by its relative importance, combine them into a composite drought risk index, and set thresholds for warning levels. And Step 5. Monitor and evaluate, continuously test and refine the indicators, the mechanism's ability to drive effective action, and its long-term sustainability. Source: FAO, 2024. So did the Madagascar activation actually work? The evidence indicates anticipatory support protected food security and reduced reliance on negative coping. The Coping Strategy Index improved by approximately 12%, anticipatory action reduced consumption-based negative coping by roughly 7 points. The Food Consumption Score improved by approximately 34% versus the counterfactual. And Resilience Capacity scores improved by approximately 8%, roughly 3 points. Beyond these headline indicators, 77% of people reported that assistance arrived in time. 81% of households used their cash mainly to purchase food. And 61% of anticipatory action households reported access to early warning information. Interpretation. The program did not remove drought stress, but it reduced deterioration by giving households resources before the worst food security impacts peaked. Let's move to Section 3.3, Planning Sector Actions and Coordination. Sector-specific strategies rely on strategic impact forecasting and proactive resource management. Let's look at the framework for selecting early actions. Selecting the right early action means working through 6 questions in sequence. Impact forecast. What drought impact is forecast? For example, a specific crop failure or water table depletion. Irreversibility. When will that impact become irreversible or costly? For example, the closure of the planting season window. Exposure. Which households, livelihoods, or systems are most at risk? For example, smallholder rain-fed farmers. Mitigation. Which action can reduce the expected loss? For example, drought-tolerant seeds or destocking. Trigger logic. What trigger gives enough lead time? For example, the SPI index or soil moisture thresholds. And financing. Which mechanism releases funds before the window closes? For example, SFERA, SURF, or WFP anticipatory action. This selection logic ensures that interventions are timely, targeted, and financially viable before peak impact occurs. Let's look at concrete interventions in the agriculture and water resource sectors. In the agriculture sector, distribution of drought-tolerant seeds and short-cycle crops, animal fodder prepositioning and vaccination campaigns, and early commercial destocking of livestock assets. In the water resource sector, solar mechanized boreholes and well rehabilitation, and water harvesting and small-scale irrigation support. Pakistan example. FAO implemented the Anticipatory Action Protocol for Agricultural Drought, distributing drought-resistant seeds and livestock feed before the dry season peak. Early measures in agriculture reduce crop loss, protect livestock, and support income and food security. Early warning, seasonal advisories and localized early warning messages. Drought seeds, provision of drought-tolerant or early maturing seeds. Cropping calendars, adjusted cropping calendars and climate-smart planting. Soil moisture conservation practices and techniques. Livestock supplies, prepositioning of animal feed, fodder, and veterinary items. Herd health, anticipatory vaccination and herd management support. And cash transfers, targeted transfers to protect assets and avoid distress sales. Why does sector-specific action matter? Anticipatory measures must be tailored to sectoral realities, institutional mandates, and local vulnerabilities. In some cases, agriculture may require action first; in others, water supply, pastoral systems, or social protection may need to be prioritized. The effectiveness of anticipatory action depends on how well these measures are matched to context and timing. As a practical example, if forecasts indicate delayed rains, agricultural extension services may advise farmers to postpone planting, switch to less water-intensive crops, or use shorter-duration seed varieties. This can reduce the risk of failed germination and protect already limited household resources. In the water sector, the goal is to manage scarcity early, reduce competition and disruption, and protect ecosystems. Reservoir monitoring, intensified monitoring of reservoirs, rivers, and groundwater. Conservation messaging, early water conservation messaging and demand management. Allocation adjustments, planned allocation shifts for irrigation and municipal supply. Infrastructure rehab, rehabilitation of boreholes, pumps, and small water systems. Preposition equipment, prepositioning of water storage and distribution equipment. Water sharing, temporary water sharing arrangements across sectors or areas. And source protection, protection of critical water sources from overuse or contamination. As a practical example, when reservoir inflows are projected to decline, water authorities may issue early advisories, revise allocation plans, repair supply infrastructure, and prioritize essential uses before shortages become acute. Scientific alerts are ineffective without defined execution paths. Operationalizing anticipatory action requires mapping every numerical threshold directly to a ready-to-deploy plan. Define action-oriented thresholds, match climate risk indices, such as soil moisture or the Standardized Precipitation Index, with specific readiness and mitigation tiers. Formulate step-by-step SOPs, produce detailed instruction sets mapping who takes action, where resources are deployed, and when the window of opportunity closes. Preposition resource pipelines, ensure that standard procedures contain pre-negotiated service agreements and pre-allocated funding pathways for instant activation. As this image illustrates, monitoring stations process real-time environmental indices to trigger pre-approved rapid actions before drought impacts escalate. Source: www.nestis.noaa.gov. Drought impacts intersect multiple systems. Scaling actions requires a governance model that bridges meteorological data providers, national disaster managers, and localized response teams. This governance model rests on three linked elements. Institutional roles, delineating clear mandates between hydrological bodies who issue forecasts, emergency authorities who declare alerts, and sector ministries who implement soil and water interventions. Coordination hubs, establishing standing interagency task forces at national and subnational levels. These hubs align technical indices with local realities and prevent overlapping or conflicting actions. And decision-making flow, creating streamlined, consensus-based or automated activation pathways, and ensuring clear linkages to disaster risk financing mechanisms for immediate, bureaucratic-free disbursement. Let's compare two complementary pieces of the machinery: standard operating procedures and coordination frameworks. Standard operating procedures set out agreed steps, what, who, and how to implement. This includes the trigger and threshold, defining when to activate, the action to activate, specifying the response steps, lead institutions and their roles and responsibilities, target locations, the priority areas and groups, and financing and release, the source and disbursement process. Coordination frameworks provide cross-sector, multi-level governance. This includes a timeline and implementation schedule, a process to share and interpret risk information, meteorological data, indices, and forecasts, joint verification and consensus to agree the trigger has been reached, communication and messaging procedures, alignment of sectoral actions across agriculture, water, health, and finance, avoidance of duplication and gaps by coordinating across all agencies, consistent, coherent community communication, and links between technical and budget authorities, with decision-makers and finance sign-off. Here's an example workflow. Once a trigger is activated, the trigger is reached and the threshold confirmed, advisories are issued by the ministry within 72 hours, communities are verified by district authorities, resources are released from contingency funds, and inputs are distributed by extension teams within 1 week. We now move to Section 3.4, Linking Finance to Field Action. Anticipatory action can only work at scale when financing is available before the crisis impacts peak. Even where good forecasts and response plans exist, early action is often delayed if financial release procedures remain slow or reactive. The trigger mechanism works in 3 linked steps. First, forecast and trigger. Early warning systems continuously monitor data. A predefined threshold based on weather, climate, or economic forecasts is reached, signaling imminent danger. Second, fund activation. The trigger acts as a reliable switch. It automatically authorizes and releases capital from prearranged financial mechanisms, without requiring further political negotiation. And third, timely early action. Funds are immediately used to implement pre-agreed operational plans, such as cash transfers, evacuations, or infrastructure reinforcement, mitigating acute impacts. There are 4 main financing mechanisms linked to anticipatory action. Contingency funds, reserve funds released when triggers are met, preset, government or program-owned, with fast disbursement. Forecast-based financing, activated on forecast thresholds before impacts, with pre-agreed action plans and early implementation. Insurance instruments, payouts when drought indicators are met, agricultural or sovereign risk transfer tools. And social protection response, existing systems scaled when risk rises, temporary expansion and shock-responsive cash. Together, these form an operational chain from forecast to action. Monitoring identifies rising risk against a threshold, the trigger is checked against agreed thresholds, moving from a risk signal to a defined response. The SOP action links trigger to SOP, defining what action should follow. Finance is rapidly unlocked, moving from trigger to finance, and institutions act on time, moving from finance to action. The operational principle here: the strongest systems create a chain, forecast, trigger, finance, action, where monitoring systems identify rising risk, triggers are checked against agreed thresholds, SOPs define what action should follow, financing is automatically or rapidly unlocked, and institutions act within a defined time frame. Let's walk through a worked example. A seasonal forecast indicates a high probability of below-average rainfall in drought-prone agricultural zones. Soil moisture observations confirm emerging stress, and water authorities report declining reservoir inflows. The possible anticipatory actions are: the Ministry of Agriculture disseminates advisories on crop choices and planting schedules, local authorities identify vulnerable farming households, drought-tolerant seed is distributed in selected districts, water departments activate conservation measures and repair critical water points, contingency resources are released through predefined procedures, and social protection systems prepare targeted temporary support for highly exposed households. This example demonstrates that anticipatory action is not a single intervention, it is a coordinated package of early measures linked to triggers, institutions, and financing. This is not a theoretical exercise. In every country where FAO has helped design a drought anticipatory action mechanism, the same step recurs: overlaying drought information onto the agricultural calendar to build a crisis timeline. The timeline answers a simple question at each stage of the season: what could happen here, and what should we do about it before it does? Afghanistan offers one of the clearest examples of why that timing matters, and it is one among several countries where this approach has already been put into practice. The same step has been applied across countries: Afghanistan, focused on wheat and rangeland; Papua New Guinea, focused on sweet potato and staple crops; Pakistan, focused on wheat across 3 provinces; and Timor-Leste, focused on agricultural drought more broadly. Source: FAO Country Anticipatory Action Programs. Let's look at Afghanistan in detail. The trigger and the response are timed to the same clock as the crop, not before it is meaningful, not after it is too late. The trigger is issued in March to April, once spring rainfall is confirmed below normal, threatening wheat production and rangeland regeneration. What it protects is May to July, the main wheat harvest and pasture season, the period the whole mechanism exists to protect. The anticipatory action window itself runs April to July, when seeds, rangeland, and livestock support are delivered. Why these dates? Wheat is most water sensitive in these months, and rangelands depend on spring rain to regenerate before the dry season. Acting in April to July is the last window where support still changes the outcome. Has this mechanism actually delivered results? The 2020-21 La Nina episode was the mechanism's first real test in Afghanistan, and it acted well ahead of the official record. In December 2020, FAO acted on early warning signs: below average rainfall forecasts, poor snowpack, high temperatures, and weak vegetation health. In June 2021, Afghanistan officially declared drought, 6 months after anticipatory action was already underway. The result: 7,680 farmers and livestock owners were supported in Samangan province, at a time when 42% of the population already faced acute food insecurity. The return on investment was strong. Every $1 spent on livestock protection returned $1.42 in avoided losses and added benefits. This approach is now systematized. The current OCHA coordinated framework uses a composite drought trigger with a 1-inch to 5.2-year return period threshold, across 5 spring rain and grain-dependent provinces: Bajis, Balkh, Faryab, Jawzjan, and Saripul. This brings us to the end of Module 3. We've covered what anticipatory action is and the principles behind it, how it compares with traditional response, how triggers are designed and refined using real activations like Madagascar's Grand Sud, sector-specific measures for agriculture and water, the governance and coordination needed to scale action, and how forecasts are linked to prearranged financing, illustrated through Afghanistan's experience. Thank you for your attention.